The night my marriage ended, I was standing alone in a narrow street in southern Spain watching my husband's rental car disappear around a dusty corner. My name is Lena Whitmore. Until that moment I was a married woman on vacation with her successful architect husband and his loud college friends. 10 seconds later I was a foreigner with no money, no passport, and no way to get back to the hotel. Evan did not even look at me when he shut the car door. His friends were laughing inside the vehicle. I could hear it through the open windows. He had been drinking all afternoon, and when I asked him to slow down he turned it into a fight. "You always think you know better," he had said with that sharp smile that meant he wanted to hurt me. Then he leaned out of the driver's window and asked if my purse had my passport in it. When I nodded he said, "Good, then you will figure it out." The engine roared and the car pulled away. I stood frozen with my mouth still open in mid-sentence. People sat at cafe tables around me sipping wine and eating dinner, as if nothing had happened. No one realized that my entire life had just been cut loose in front of them. I whispered to myself that Evan would come back, that this was a cruel joke meant to scare me. But the minutes passed. The streetlights flickered on, the sky turned black, and my husband did not return. That was the moment I stopped being a wife and became something else. A woman completely alone in a foreign country with nothing but fear and one last chance to decide who she would become. Before that night in Spain I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the supportive wife of a respected architect. I hosted elegant dinner parties in our Boston townhouse. I kept our calendar organized and our home flawless. People used to tell Evan how lucky he was to have me, and he would smile like I was one of his finest achievements. But I was not always that woman. I used to be a designer, not a hobbyist but a professional who had spent years studying interiors, lighting, and space. I loved transforming empty rooms into places that made people feel safe and inspired. That was my first identity before I became Mrs. Whitmore. When Evan and I married, he said he loved my ambition. He said he admired my creativity. But little by little that admiration turned into something else. He would offer to manage our finances to make things easier. Then he suggested I turn down projects so I could focus on our home. Then he started joking about my career as if it was something cute but unnecessary. "Why stress yourself?" he would say. "We do not need your income. I need you here." At first it sounded like love. It sounded like partnership. Over time it became a cage. My credit cards were in his wallet. My business contacts faded because I was always too busy with Evan's work events. Even my friends slowly disappeared because he always had a reason they were a bad influence. I did not notice how small my life had become until it was gone. Like a plant kept in shade too long, I was still alive but no longer growing. And when Evan drove away that night, he did not just leave me in a foreign town. He left behind a woman who had forgotten she was ever capable of standing on her own. At first I kept checking my phone every few seconds. I told myself Evan was driving around the block. I imagined him laughing with his friends, and then turning the car back toward me once he had made his point. I even practiced what I would say when he returned, something calm, something forgiving. But the calls went straight to voicemail. I tried texting him. The messages showed delivered but never answered. Then I tried his friends. Pete, Ryan, Marcus, every number was blocked. That was when the truth began to sink in. This was not a mistake. It was not a drunken prank. It was a decision. I walked through the small Spanish town searching every street and restaurant. I went into hotels and asked if a tour group had checked in. I stared into parked cars hoping to see a familiar face. Nothing. By the time the sun went down I had counted my cash. 80 euros and a few crumpled dollars. Not enough for a flight, not even enough for a proper hotel. I found the cheapest place I could afford, a tiny room above a bakery with a narrow bed and a sink in the corner. The old woman who rented it to me did not speak English, but when she saw my shaking hands she nodded like she understood. That night I lay awake listening to the ovens downstairs and staring at my phone. 27 missed calls to Evan. 0 replies. That was the moment I stopped hoping. My husband had not just left me behind. He had erased me. By the third morning I knew no one was coming for me. I had walked the edges of the town twice. I had asked strangers for directions I could barely understand. I had waited in cafes long after my single cup of coffee was finished, just so I would not feel completely alone. Evan and his friends had moved on to the next city without a second thought. That was when I stood in front of a small pawn shop window and made the hardest decision of my life. My wedding ring caught the light as I twisted it off my finger. It was the upgraded one Evan had given me on our 5th anniversary. 2 carats, bright and cold and heavy with every promise he had broken. Inside the shop, the owner barely looked at me. He weighed the ring, he examined the stone, then he offered me far less than it was worth. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him this ring had once meant everything. But all it meant now was survival. I took the money. As the door closed behind me, the weight on my hand was gone, so was the illusion that I was still someone's wife. I could have called my father. I could have begged for a wire transfer and a flight home, but that would mean explaining. It would mean facing all the people who had warned me about Evan. And more than anything, it would mean walking back into the life where I had slowly disappeared. Instead, I walked toward the bus station. Sometimes freedom does not feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like standing on the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump. The bus station was nearly empty when I arrived. A flickering electronic board listed cities I had only ever seen in travel magazines. I stood there for a long time watching the names change until one of them stopped feeling frightening and started feeling far away enough. Crete. I did not know anyone there. I did not speak the language. That was exactly why it felt right. I bought the cheapest ticket that would take me out of the country. It was an overnight ride with 2 connections and no guarantee of comfort, but it was movement, and that was all I needed. As the bus pulled away from the station, I watched the Spanish town disappear through a dusty window. Part of me expected Evan to appear at the last second, to knock on the glass and drag me back. He did not. The road stretched ahead through dark countryside. My body was exhausted, but my mind would not rest. Fear and relief took turns in my chest. I was terrified of what waited for me in Greece. But I was even more afraid of going back to the life I had escaped. By the time the bus crossed the border, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer running away. I was choosing where to go. When I finally stepped off the last bus, the air smelled like salt and olive trees. White buildings glowed under the morning sun. I had just enough money for a few nights and no idea what I would do after that. But for the first time in years, no one was telling me where I had to be. I was alone. And strangely, that felt like power. By the time I left the small bus station in Crete, my body was already giving up on me. My sandals were never meant for walking long distances. My feet burned with every step. I had not eaten a real meal in days and my water bottle was empty. The road stretched through endless olive trees, their silver-green leaves flashing in the sunlight like tiny mirrors. It should have been beautiful. Instead, the world began to tilt. I remember thinking that this was fitting, abandoned in one country, collapsing in another. My knees buckled. The ground rushed up and everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, a woman was leaning over me. Her hair was gray and pulled back in a simple bun. Her face was lined but kind. She spoke in Greek, touching my cheek and offering a canteen. The water brought me back just enough to sit up. She pointed to herself, Margaret. Then she pointed to a stone farmhouse at the edge of the grove and made a walking motion with her fingers. I nodded because I did not have the strength to argue. A man appeared moments later, tall and weathered with a gentle seriousness in his eyes. She called him Thomas. Together they lifted me to my feet and guided me toward their home. The kitchen smelled of herbs and something warm cooking on the stove. Margaret sat me at a wooden table and placed a bowl of soup in front of me. I had not cried since Spain. But that was when the tears came. These 2 strangers had no idea who I was or what I had lost. And they were saving me anyway. That first night at the farmhouse felt unreal. Margaret showed me to a small whitewashed room with a narrow bed and a handmade quilt. It was simple but clean and safe. I slept deeper than I had since the day Evan drove away. When I woke up, fresh bread and strong coffee were waiting on the kitchen table. A folded dress sat at the foot of my bed. It was not mine, but it fit well enough to make me feel human again. I tried to explain that I could not stay, that I had to go back to the village and find a place of my own. But Margaret shook her head every time. Stay, she said in careful English. Rain tapped against the windows as if agreeing with her. Over the next 2 days I made several attempts to leave. Each time she gently stopped me. Once she led me to a small wooden box on the shelf. Inside were photographs. A young woman who looked like her. A man I guessed was Thomas when he was younger. And a baby. Daughter, she said softly. Australia. No, here. I understood then. She was not just helping a stranger. She was filling the space her child had left behind. Instead of feeling trapped, I felt something warmer, chosen. So I put my purse back on the hook by the door. That was the moment I stopped being a guest. I was being invited into a life. Margaret did not let me stay idle. Before the sun was fully up, she woke me with a gentle knock and handed me work clothes and boots that had once belonged to her daughter. They were too big, but I tightened the laces and followed her outside. The olive grove stretched across the hillside. Thomas showed me how to place nets under the trees and how to gently comb the branches so the fruit would fall without damage. My first attempt was clumsy. Leaves and twigs rained down instead of olives. He did not scold me. He simply showed me again. By midday, my shoulders ached and my palms were raw. Margaret laughed softly when she saw the blisters. City hands, she teased. She brought out a homemade salve that smelled of herbs and honey and rubbed it into my skin. Tomorrow better, she promised. And she was right. Each day I grew stronger. Each day I dropped fewer olives and made fewer mistakes. The work was hard, but it was honest. No one was watching me to judge how I looked. No one was measuring my worth by how well I entertained guests. I was valuable because I worked. When we sorted the olives under the shade of a wooden pergola, Margaret taught me how to tell which ones were best for oil and which ones would be used for soap. Her eyes followed my hands, at first correcting me when I missed something. After a week, she stopped. You learn fast, Thomas said quietly one evening. It was the first time in years someone had praised me for what I could do instead of who I was married to. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things about the olive oil business that Margaret and Thomas had simply accepted. Their oil was beautiful, but their bottles looked plain. Their labels were hard to read. At the village market, people loved the product but often walked past the table without noticing it. One afternoon, I asked if I could help. Using a borrowed laptop and my old design skills, I created simple, clean labels. I added descriptions of the flavor and suggested foods it paired well with. Nothing fancy, just clear and inviting. Margaret watched over my shoulder, her eyes lighting up as the first new label printed. Beautiful thinking, she said, tapping her temple. At the next market day, we used the new bottles. People stopped. They asked questions. They picked up the bottles. They bought more than usual. For the first time since Spain, I felt something I had not realized I missed. Professional pride. I was not pretending to be useful. I was useful. In the evenings, I showed Margaret how to keep track of sales on a spreadsheet. She had always written everything in notebooks. Now she could see patterns, which oils sold best, which markets were worth the long drive. She stared at the screen as if I had revealed a secret map. Boston brain, good for business, she joked. It felt good to laugh. The woman Evan had slowly silenced was finding her voice again. And this time no one was telling her to keep it down. 3 months after I arrived, Margaret and Thomas called me into the small room where they kept their records. On the table were papers written in both Greek and English. I did not understand what they were at first. Then Margaret took my hand. We old, she said gently. No children here. You work hard. You care. We want you here. Thomas nodded and pushed the papers toward me. It was a partnership agreement. They were offering me part ownership of the olive farm. Not someday, not after years of waiting. Now. My chest tightened as I read the words. This was not charity. This was recognition. I had earned a place. I tried to tell them they did not owe me anything, that I was just grateful for the roof and the food and the kindness. Margaret shook her head. Fair work, fair share. I signed. For the first time since my marriage began, I owned something that no one could take away from me. Not my husband, not my past, not my fear. That night I lay in bed listening to the wind move through the olive trees. I was not hiding. I was building. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be afraid of Evan. Months had passed since Spain. My days were filled with harvesting, sorting, cooking, and selling. My nights were quiet and honest. Then one evening, as I checked my old phone, an unfamiliar message appeared. I know where you are. My hands went cold. The email was from Evan. He wrote that he had hired a private investigator, that he had tracked me to Crete, that this had gone on long enough. "I am coming to bring you home," he wrote. "My flight lands Thursday." 3 days. I stared at the screen as a mix of panic and anger surged through me. After all that time, after leaving me with nothing. Now he wanted me back. Not because he missed me, because I had embarrassed him. Margaret saw my face and knew something was wrong. When I told her, she did not panic. She went to a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside were legal documents, the partnership agreement we had signed weeks earlier. "You have home here," she said. "You have work here." You have people here?" That man, she tapped my phone. "He no longer chooses." For the first time since I received Evan's message, I could breathe. He was coming. But he was not coming to take me anywhere. The next 3 days were not about running. They were about getting ready. With the help of a local lawyer, I filled out divorce papers in English and Greek. Every signature felt like a quiet declaration of independence. I emailed my old design mentor back in Boston and accepted a remote consulting job she had once offered me. Work I could do from anywhere, income that would belong only to me. I even wrote to a few old friends. I did not explain everything. I simply told them I was safe and building something new. Margaret and Thomas watched me with calm pride. They did not ask me what I would do. They trusted that I knew. By the time Thursday arrived, I was not shaking. I was steady. Evan was about to walk into a life he no longer controlled. And I was ready to meet him as an equal. Evan arrived in a silver rental car just after lunch. I was in the processing shed testing olive oil when the sound of the engine broke the quiet. Margaret appeared in the doorway. "He is here." I wiped my hands and stepped outside. Evan stood beside the car wearing expensive sunglasses and a shirt that probably cost more than a week of our sales. He looked around the farmhouse with visible disgust. Then he saw me. His eyes moved from my work boots to my sun-browned arms and simple clothes. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Life happened," I said. "I came to take you home," he replied as if nothing had changed. "This is my home," I said calmly. He laughed. "You are a designer, not a farmer. This is a phase. You made your point. Now get in the car." I held out the divorce papers. "You left me, Evan. You drove away laughing. You do not get to decide what happens next." His face turned red. "I was drunk. I made a mistake." I said, "I am sorry." "You are sorry because people noticed I was gone," I replied. "Not because you hurt me." Margaret and Thomas stood behind me, silent but strong. "I have a business here," I said. "A partnership. A life." He stared at me as if I were speaking another language. "You will regret this," he said. "Maybe," I replied. "But I will never regret choosing myself." He took the papers with stiff hands and turned back to his car. The road swallowed him. And he never looked back. The farm felt different after Evan left. Not quieter. Lighter. The olive trees still rustled in the breeze. The chickens still wandered through the yard. Margaret still hummed while she cooked. But something heavy had lifted from the air. I went back to work that afternoon, bottling oil, updating orders, planning the next market day. Life did not pause because a man had lost his grip on me. It moved forward. Weeks later, I signed my name on the first official invoice of our business. My name, not Evan's. Lena Whitmore. Partner. Sometimes I still think about that night in Spain, the laughter, the car disappearing. If he had not left me there, I might still be living a life that looked perfect and felt empty. Instead, I wake up every morning to sunlight on olive leaves and people who see me for who I am, not who I serve. Freedom does not always arrive wrapped in kindness. Sometimes it comes disguised as abandonment. If you are listening to this and you feel trapped in a life that no longer fits you, I want you to hear this clearly. Being left behind does not mean you are unwanted. Sometimes it means you are standing in the wrong place. Losing someone who tried to control you is not a failure. It is an opening. I did not rebuild my life because I was brave. I rebuilt it because I finally stopped being afraid to be alone. And in that silence, I found out who I really was. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find stories of strength and quiet courage. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And leave a comment telling me where you are listening from or what part of this story felt familiar to you. Thank you for being here. This is The Art of Revenge, where we turn pain into power and loss into new beginnings.